The letter fell from Margaret Jones's trembling hands to the dusty floorboards of the San Bernardino, California stagecoach station as she stared in disbelief at the woman standing before her. Mrs. Henry Thompson, there should be no Mrs. Henry Thompson, for Margaret herself was promised to be the first and only wife of the man whose advertisement she had answered 3 months prior. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the bustle of the station. It was July 1875, and the scorching California heat seemed to press down upon her shoulders along with the weight of this terrible revelation. "Mr. Thompson wrote to me. He sent for me, from Boston." The woman standing before her petite with honey-colored hair and eyes hard as flint crossed her arms over her chest. "Henry's been my husband for 5 years. Whatever promises he made to you, Miss Jones, were lies." Margaret fought back tears as her dreams crumbled around her. After her parents' death from influenza last winter, she had been left with nothing but debts and a respectable upbringing that qualified her for little beyond a governess position. Henry Thompson's advertisement seeking a refined Eastern lady to share in the prosperity of a growing cattle ranch had seemed like providence. He paid for my passage," Margaret said weakly, gesturing to her 3 trunks stacked beside her. 22 years old and 3,000 miles from home, she now stood completely alone. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Henry's always been ambitious and foolish. When he heard about the new land grants opening up near the pass, he got it in his head that he needed more hands to work it. I suppose a second wife seemed economical to him." Her mouth twisted bitterly. "He's currently occupied with the sheriff, explaining his unique interpretation of matrimonial law." Margaret sank onto her largest trunk, her corset suddenly feeling too tight to breathe. The station around her continued its normal activity, passengers coming and going, workers loading luggage, a group of cowboys laughing by the ticket counter, all oblivious to her catastrophe. "What will you do?" Mrs. Thompson asked, not unkindly. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I have $8 to my name. The return fare to Boston is $40. She touched the small gold locket at her throat, her mother's, and the last valuable she possessed. Mrs. Thompson sighed. "I'd offer you lodging while you sort things out, but I imagine that would be uncomfortable for us both. There's a decent boarding house for women 2 streets over." She hesitated, then added, "I truly am sorry." As the woman walked away, Margaret fought to compose herself. San Bernardino had seemed like such a promise in Henry's letters, a growing town nestled at the foot of majestic mountains, with opportunities spreading as wide as the valley. Now it felt like a trap. "Excuse me, madam, couldn't help overhearing." Margaret looked up, hastily wiping away a tear. A tall man stood before her, hat in hand. Dust covered his denim trousers and the shoulders of his worn leather vest. His face was tanned and weathered, but his eyes were startlingly kind. "Matthew Lawson," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "I ranch the property adjacent to Thompson's." "Margaret Jones," she replied automatically, her proper Boston upbringing asserting itself even in crisis. "Miss Jones, I don't mean to intrude on private matters, but Thompson's been bragging about his mail-order bride for weeks. Half the county knew you were coming." His expression darkened. "Most of us also knew he was already married." Margaret felt fresh humiliation wash over her. "I see." "No, you don't," Matthew said gently. "What I'm saying is that Thompson is the one who should be ashamed, not you, and folks around here aren't going to hold his deception against you." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Lawson, but sympathy won't secure me passage back to Boston." "No, but honest work might." He replaced his hat, adjusting it against the glare of the sun streaming through the station windows. "My sister runs the general store here in town. She's been looking for someone who can keep books and assist customers. It wouldn't pay much to start, but it includes a room above the shop." Hope flickered briefly in Margaret's chest before caution extinguished it. "Why would your sister hire a complete stranger?" Matthew's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Because good help is hard to find in these parts, Miss Jones, and because Sarah trusts my judgment." He glanced at her trunks. "Besides, Anyone organized enough to travel across the country with their belongings so neatly packed probably knows something about keeping order. Margaret found herself returning his smile despite herself. I was raised in a merchant household, Mr. Lawson. I can manage inventory and accounts. Well then, he said, signaling to a young man lounging by the wall, let's get your trunks loaded and see what Sarah thinks. Within the hour, Margaret found herself standing in Lawson's General Store, a surprisingly well-stocked establishment on San Bernardino's Main Street. The shelves held everything from dried goods to tools to fabric, and a small pharmaceutical counter occupied the back wall. Sarah Lawson was as direct as her brother, but with a warmth that put Margaret instantly at ease. At 30, she was unmarried and unapologetic about it, having inherited the store from their father 5 years earlier. Matthew tells me you can cipher, Sarah said, studying Margaret with shrewd blue eyes so similar to her brother's. Can you also manage difficult customers without losing your temper? I once helped my father negotiate with Boston's most notorious textile merchant during a shipment dispute, Margaret replied. He left with less than he demanded, but believing he'd won a great victory. Sarah laughed, a rich sound that filled the store. Hired, she declared. Room and board plus $8 a week to start. If you're as good as you claim, we'll discuss a percentage after 3 months. That evening, Margaret sat on the narrow bed in her new room, writing in her journal by lamplight. The room was simple but clean: a bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a chair. The window overlooked the main street, now quiet as businesses closed for the night. Dear Mother and Father, she wrote, though they would never read her words. I have arrived in California to find that Providence works in unexpected ways. Mr. Thompson proved false, but I find myself not destitute but employed, with a roof over my head and new acquaintances who have shown me great kindness. A soft knock interrupted her writing. Opening the door, she found Matthew Lawson holding a covered basket. Sarah asked me to bring this up, he said, offering the basket. She thought you might be hungry after your journey. That's very thoughtful, Margaret replied, accepting it. Inside, she found freshly baked bread, cheese, dried apple slices, and a small jar of preserves. Please thank her for me. Matthew nodded but made no move to leave. Will you be all right, Miss Jones? Today has brought you considerable shock. The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid her careful composure. I believe I will be, Mr. Lawson, though not in the way I had imagined. Few of us end up where we imagined, he said quietly. I came west to find gold. Instead, I found land that speaks to my soul and work that satisfies me more than riches would have. Margaret studied him more carefully. Beneath the dust and weathered exterior, she recognized education in his speech and thoughtfulness in his manner. How long have you been in San Bernardino? 8 years. Came in 67 after the war. He didn't specify which side he'd fought on, and Margaret didn't ask. Those wounds were still fresh for many. Bought my land when prices dropped during the drought of 70. And you ranch cattle and horses. Mostly I break and train stock for the army and stagecoach companies. Pride crept into his voice. My horses are sought after throughout Southern California. Their conversation continued easily for several minutes until Matthew glanced at the darkening sky outside her window. I should let you rest, he said, stepping back. Sarah rises early and she'll expect the same of you. Mr. Lawson, Margaret called as he turned to leave. Thank you not just for the food but for intervening today. It was uncommonly kind. His eyes softened. Get some rest, Miss Jones. San Bernardino looks different in the morning light. Better, I think you'll find. As she closed the door behind him, Margaret found herself wondering about the rancher next door to both Thompson's property and now her own lodgings. There was something steadfast about Matthew Lawson that called to mind the oak trees of her Massachusetts home, deeply rooted and unshakable. She returned to her journal, adding a postscript. I have met a man today who reminds me that honor still exists in this world. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight, at least, I am not afraid to face it. The following weeks passed in a blur of new experiences for Margaret. She quickly proved her worth at the general store, reorganizing the bookkeeping system and implementing inventory controls that saved Sarah both time and money. The store became busier as word spread that the new Eastern lady had brought order to the shelves and could find any item a customer requested within moments. San Bernardino itself was a revelation, a vibrant community where the Spanish-speaking Californios mixed with American settlers, Mormon farmers, and a steady stream of prospectors and cowboys passing through. Though smaller than Boston, the town boasted several churches, a schoolhouse, 2 hotels, and numerous saloons that Margaret carefully avoided. Of Henry Thompson, she heard little. The sheriff had released him with a warning, and Mrs. Thompson had apparently extracted promises of better behavior. Margaret occasionally saw the woman in town, and they exchanged civil nods but nothing more. Matthew Lawson became a regular visitor to the store, though Margaret noted his purchases rarely justified the frequency of his calls. Sometimes he brought fresh vegetables from his garden or wild honey from hives on his property. Once he appeared with a book of Tennyson's poetry that he thought might remind her of home. "Do all cowboys read Tennyson?" she teased him as they stood in the quiet store one afternoon. "Only the ones who attended Yale before deciding cattle were better company than most men," he replied with a wink that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. On Sundays after church, Matthew often invited Margaret to ride with him. At first, she declined, citing her limited experience with horses. When she finally accepted in her 4th week, she discovered Matthew had selected the gentlest mare in his stable and patiently taught her to ride Western style, a shocking departure from the side-saddle propriety of her Boston upbringing. "You can't appreciate California from inside a carriage," he insisted as they rode along a ridge overlooking the valley. The September day was clear, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. "This land demands to be experienced." Margaret had to admit he was right. The vastness of the landscape both humbled and exhilarated her. "It's beautiful," she breathed, reining in her horse beside his. "So different from Massachusetts' wilder somehow." "That's what drew me here," Matthew said, his gaze sweeping across his land spread below them. "The freedom of it. The sense that you can remake yourself if you have the courage." His words struck a chord within her. Wasn't that what she was doing now? Remaking herself from a merchant's dutiful daughter to an independent woman earning her own way. "I never imagined myself here," she admitted. "Yet now I can hardly remember what I thought my life would be." Matthew turned to her, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Do you regret coming?" The question hung between them as Margaret considered it honestly. "No," she finally said. "Despite how it began, I don't regret it. There's something invigorating about building a life on your own terms." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "That's the spirit of the West talking, Margaret Jones. Be careful it gets into your blood." As autumn progressed, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet rancher. Unlike the polished Boston gentleman of her past, Matthew was refreshingly direct. He worked with his hands, thought deeply, and treated everyone from the Cahuilla Indians who sometimes traded at the store to the Chinese laborers, who maintained the new railroad lines with equal respect. When Margaret asked about this, Matthew simply said, "The war taught me that men bleed the same color, regardless of where they come from or what language they speak." She learned that he had indeed fought for the Union, though as a Connecticut volunteer rather than a career soldier. His father had lost everything in a banking collapse after the war, prompting Matthew's westward journey in search of new opportunities. "I had nothing but my education and a stubborn unwillingness to fail," he told her one evening as they sat on the store's back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. "The first 2 years were brutal drought, disease, predators taking my calves, but I learned, adapted." "You persevered," Margaret said softly. He shrugged. "Had no choice, couldn't go back east with my tail between my legs." "Pride is a powerful motivator," she observed. "Says the woman who refused to return to Boston despite being deceived," he countered with gentle humor. Margaret smiled. "Perhaps we're more alike than I realized, Mr. Lawson." "Matthew," he corrected her. "After 2 months of conversation, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" The invitation to familiarity sent a flutter through her stomach that Margaret tried to ignore. She was building a new life here, focusing on independence. Developing feelings for the neighboring rancher wasn't part of her plan. Yet, as October turned to November, Margaret found herself looking forward to Matthew's visits with increasing anticipation. They debated books and politics, shared stories of their childhoods, and gradually built a friendship unlike any Margaret had known in Boston. Sarah noticed, of course. "My brother hasn't spent this much time in town since the drought forced him to haul water from the municipal well," she commented one morning as they unpacked a shipment of winter goods. Margaret concentrated on folding a heavy wool blanket. "He's been very kind in helping me adjust to life here." "Kind," Sarah repeated with a knowing smile. "Is that what they're calling courtship these days?" "He isn't courting me," Margaret protested, though her heart quickened at the suggestion. Sarah just laughed. "Margaret, I've known my brother for 30 years. He doesn't ride into town 3 times a week to discuss inventory and the weather." Before Margaret could respond, the store bell jangled. She turned, expecting to see Matthew instead. Henry Thompson stood in the doorway. The man was shorter than she remembered from his daguerreotype, with a florid complexion and small, darting eyes. He removed his hat, revealing thinning hair plastered to his scalp. "Miss Jones," he said, stepping forward, "I've come to make amends." Sarah moved protectively to Margaret's side. "Mr. Thompson, you have some nerve showing your face here." Thompson had the grace to look abashed. "I know what I did was wrong, unforgivable even, but I've come to make it right." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "This contains $40, enough for your return fare to Boston, plus compensation for your trouble." Margaret stared at the envelope but made no move to take it. "What prompted this sudden attack of conscience, Mr. Thompson?" He shifted uncomfortably. "My wife. She insisted. And the Reverend has been quite pointed in his sermons about honesty and responsibility lately." "How convenient for your soul," Sarah remarked coldly. Thompson flushed. "I'm trying to do the honorable thing." "The honorable thing," Margaret said evenly, "would have been not to propose marriage when you already had a wife." "Yes, well." Thompson placed the envelope on the counter. "The money is yours regardless. Do with it what you will." He turned to leave, then paused. "I hear you've been spending time with Lawson." The sudden change of subject caught Margaret off guard. "Mr. Lawson has been kind enough to show me the area," she replied carefully. Thompson's mouth twisted. "Just be careful. There's more to him than meets the eye." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, irritation rising. "Ask him about the Miller property," Thompson said cryptically, then settled his hat on his head and departed. The store felt unusually quiet after he left. Margaret stared at the envelope on the counter, emotions churning. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked gently. "Yes," Margaret said, surprised to find it was true. "Seeing him. It didn't affect me as I thought it might. He seems rather pitiful, doesn't he?" Sarah squeezed her arm. "The money would take you back to Boston if that's what you want." Margaret considered this. 2 months ago, she would have seized the opportunity. Now, the thought of returning to Boston felt like retreating. "I think," she said slowly, "that I might use it to buy into the store instead if you're still amenable to that arrangement." Sarah's face lit up. "I was hoping you'd say that. We could expand the millinery section you've been talking about." As they excitedly discussed possibilities, Margaret pushed Thompson's cryptic warning about Matthew to the back of her mind. Whatever he'd meant about the Miller property, it was likely just spite from a man with little else to offer. That evening, as Margaret closed up the store, the bell jangled again. Matthew stood in the doorway, a bundle of late-blooming wildflowers in his hand. "I heard Thompson came by," he said without preamble. Sarah sent word. Margaret smiled at his protective expression. "I'm fine. He actually brought money for my return passage to Boston." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes. "Are you going?" "No," she said simply. "I'm staying. This is my home now." The tension visibly left his shoulders. "I'm glad to hear it." He offered the wildflowers. "These won't last much longer before the frost takes them. Seemed a shame to let them go unappreciated." Margaret accepted them, touched by the gesture. "They're beautiful, thank you." Matthew watched as she arranged them in a jar of water. "Would you join me for supper at the hotel restaurant to celebrate your decision to stay?" The invitation was innocent enough, but Margaret sensed a shift in their relationship, something more intentional than their casual Sunday rides or impromptu conversations. "I'd like that," she said, and was rewarded with a smile that made her heart skip. The Central Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in San Bernardino, with white tablecloths and a French chef who had mysteriously appeared after the recent completion of the Southern Pacific Railroad line. Matthew had clearly made an effort with his appearance, his usual work clothes replaced by a well-cut suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. Over roast beef and potatoes, more elegantly prepared than Margaret had expected in a frontier town, their conversation flowed easily. Yet she found herself distracted by Thompson's warning, which now nagged at her like a splinter. "Matthew," she finally said during a lull, "what is the Miller property?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Where did you hear about that?" Thompson mentioned it. "He said I should ask you about it." Matthew set down his fork, his expression guarded. "Of course he did." He sighed. "The Miller property adjoins mine to the south. Nathan Miller was one of the first ranchers in the area. He died 3 years ago." And, Margaret prompted when he fell silent. "And I purchased his land from his widow at a price some considered too favorable." Matthew met her eyes directly. Thompson among them. He'd been trying to buy it for years. Margaret studied him. "Was it too favorable?" "Mrs. Miller approached me," Matthew said evenly. "Her husband left considerable debts. She needed to sell quickly and wanted the land to go to someone who would respect her husband's work, not subdivide it for quick profit as Thompson planned. So you helped her." "I paid a fair price based on what she needed and what I could afford," Matthew said. "Then I hired her son to manage part of my expanded herd, giving the family additional income. They moved to San Diego last year to be near her sister. Young Miller still writes me monthly about his new position with the Harbor Commission." Margaret felt relief wash over her. "I thought perhaps that I'd taken advantage of a widow." Matthew's voice held no judgment, just sadness. "Thompson would like people to think so. He's still bitter about losing that land." "I'm sorry for doubting you," Margaret said softly. Matthew reached across the table to briefly touch her hand. "Don't be. Asking directly was the right thing to do. I respect that." The rest of their meal passed pleasantly, and as they walked back to the store under a star-filled sky, Margaret felt a growing certainty that this man, honorable, thoughtful, and steadfast, was becoming essential to her happiness. At her door, Matthew hesitated. "I've been invited to spend Thanksgiving with the Prestons at their ranch outside town. Would you consider accompanying me? Sarah is already planning to attend. Thanksgiving, a family holiday. The invitation carried weight beyond a simple social engagement." "I'd be delighted," Margaret said, warmth spreading through her chest at his obvious pleasure. "Good night, Margaret," he said softly, his eyes lingering on her face in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Good night, Matthew." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had transformed in just 3 months. The disaster of her arrival had led her to this place of new beginnings and unexpected possibilities. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt not just secure but hopeful about her future. The Thanksgiving gathering at the Preston Ranch was unlike any holiday Margaret had experienced in Boston. Instead of formal dining rooms and starched linens, tables were set up in the Prestons' barn, cleared of hay and decorated with pine boughs and candles. Nearly 40 people attended, neighboring ranchers, townspeople, and even a group of Cahuilla Indians who worked seasonally on the Preston property. "This is wonderful," Margaret exclaimed as she helped Sarah arrange pies on a side table. The air was filled with the scents of roasting turkey, sage dressing, and sweet potatoes. "Wait until the dancing starts," Sarah replied with a grin. The Prestons believe Thanksgiving isn't complete without a proper celebration. True to her word, after the meal, several ranch hands produced fiddles and guitars. Tables were pushed aside, and couples began to fill the impromptu dance floor. Matthew appeared at Margaret's side, his hand extended in invitation. "May I have this dance, Miss Jones?" Margaret hesitated. "I only know Eastern dances, waltzes, and quadrilles." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Then it's time you learned something new." The dance was a lively reel that had Margaret laughing as she tried to follow the unfamiliar steps. Matthew proved a patient teacher, his hand steady at her waist as he guided her through the turns. "You're a natural," he said as the music ended, leaving them slightly breathless and standing closer than propriety strictly allowed. "Or perhaps you're an excellent teacher," she countered, making no move to step away. The fiddlers struck up a slower tune, and without asking, Matthew drew her back into his arms. This dance required less concentration, allowing Margaret to notice the warmth of his hand against her back and the subtle scent of sandalwood that clung to his collar. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, his voice low near her ear, "about making some changes to my house before winter fully sets in. It's rather plain at present." "Oh," Margaret responded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Yes, it was built for function, not comfort." "A bachelor's quarters." His eyes met hers. "But lately I've been thinking it could be more," understanding dawned. "What sort of changes did you have in mind?" she asked, her heartbeat quickening. "Curtains, for one thing, perhaps some rugs, definitely a larger kitchen." His expression grew serious. The kind of touches that make a house a home, the kind a woman might appreciate. The dance ended, but neither of them moved apart. Around them, other couples were starting the next dance, but they remained in their own world. "That sounds like quite a transformation," Margaret said carefully. "Are you certain it's what you want? More certain than I've ever been about anything." Matthew took a deep breath. "Margaret, I know it's only been 3 months since you arrived, but a commotion at the barn entrance interrupted his words. Sheriff Davis stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "Sorry to intrude, folks," he called over the suddenly quieted music, "but I need volunteers. Thompson's youngest boy is missing, wandered off from their place about 2 hours ago. Night's coming on cold and we need to find him before dark." The festive atmosphere immediately dissolved as men reached for coats and hats. Matthew squeezed Margaret's hand. "I have to help." "Of course," she agreed immediately. "What can I do?" "Stay here with Sarah and the other women. Help Mrs. Preston prepare food and coffee for the search parties when they return." He hesitated, then quickly pressed his lips to her forehead. "We'll finish our conversation later." Within minutes, the barn had emptied of men, leaving the women to clear away the celebration and prepare for what might become a long night. "He was going to propose, wasn't he?" Sarah asked quietly as she and Margaret folded tablecloths. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. "Well, the boy's interruption doesn't change his intentions," Sarah said practically. "Just delays things a bit." "Do you think they'll find the child?" Margaret asked, worry replacing the joy of moments earlier. Sarah's expression sobered. "I pray so. These mountains are no place for a little one alone after dark." As night fell, Margaret found herself pacing the Preston farmhouse, peering anxiously out windows into the gathering darkness. The temperature had dropped sharply, and she could see the searchers' breath clouding as they gathered around lanterns to coordinate their efforts. Mrs. Thompson arrived with her 2 older children, her face drawn with fear. Despite their complicated history, Margaret's heart went out to the woman. "They'll find him," she assured Mrs. Thompson, bringing her a cup of hot coffee. "Matthew knows these mountains better than anyone." Mrs. Thompson looked up sharply. "Matthew Lawson, he's searching too. He organized the southern search parties," Margaret explained. A strange expression crossed Mrs. Thompson's face. "After everything Henry's said about him." "Your son's welfare is more important than ranch disputes," Margaret said firmly. Mrs. Thompson studied her for a long moment. "You care for him, Lawson." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "I do, very much. Henry will be." "Surprised," Mrs. Thompson said with a hint of satisfaction that suggested her marriage remained strained. Before Margaret could respond, a shout went up outside. They rushed to the window to see a group of riders approaching, Matthew at the lead with a small bundle wrapped in his coat held securely before him. "He found him," Mrs. Thompson cried, running for the door. The scene that followed was chaotic but joyful. 4-year-old David Thompson was cold and frightened but uninjured, having been found sheltering in a shallow cave nearly 3 miles from the ranch. Matthew had tracked the boy's footprints by lantern light across increasingly difficult terrain. Even Henry Thompson appeared genuinely grateful, shaking Matthew's hand repeatedly as his wife clutched their recovered son. I don't know how to thank you, Lawson, if you hadn't found him before the temperature dropped further. No thanks needed, Matthew said simply. Any man would have done the same. Later, as the Thompsons prepared to depart with their children, Henry approached Margaret where she stood helping distribute coffee to the returning searchers. Miss Jones, he said awkwardly, it appears I've misjudged many things, including you and Lawson. He glanced to where Matthew was speaking with the sheriff. A man reveals his true character in a crisis, they say. Tonight has been illuminating, Margaret nodded, accepting the closest thing to an apology she was likely to receive from him. I'm simply glad David is safe. As am I. Thompson hesitated, then added gruffly, I hope you find happiness here, Miss Jones. I truly do. As the gathering dispersed, Matthew finally approached Margaret, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. You're a hero, she said softly. He shook his head. Just fortunate. Another hour and we might have been too late. Sarah says we can stay at the Prestons tonight. It's too late to return to town safely. Matthew nodded, swaying slightly with fatigue. I need to check on my horse first, make sure he's properly cared for after the hard ride. I'll come with you, Margaret said, reaching for her shawl. The Preston barn was quiet now, the festive decorations standing in stark contrast to the evening's drama. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the stalls where horses drowsed. Matthew tended to his mount with gentle efficiency, murmuring praise as he checked the animal for any injuries. Margaret watched, struck by the care in his large, capable hands. You were going to ask me something, she said when he had finished, before the interruption. Matthew turned to her, fatigue momentarily forgotten. Yes, I was. He took a step closer. Margaret Jones, I know you came to California under false pretenses, expecting a different life entirely. But I've thanked God every day for Thompson's deception, because it brought you here to San Bernardino, to the store, to me. Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. Matthew, please let me finish before my courage fails. He took her hands in his. I love you, Margaret. Your intelligence, your determination, your kindness, the way you've embraced this new life instead of being defeated by disappointment, the way you see beauty in this rough country. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as joy welled up inside her. I love you too, she whispered. So much that it frightens me sometimes. Then marry me, he said simply. Build a life with me here. It won't always be easy, ranching never is, but I swear I'll work every day to be worthy of your love. Yes, Margaret answered without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, Margaret laughed softly. What's amusing? Matthew asked, still holding her close. I came to California to marry a rancher I'd never met, she explained. And in the end, that's exactly what I'll do, just not the one I expected. His answering smile was tender. Life rarely follows the paths we plan, but sometimes it leads us exactly where we're meant to be. Winter passed in a flurry of preparations. Margaret continued working at the store while planning her spring wedding and learning all she could about ranching from Matthew. Sarah, thrilled at the engagement, insisted on ordering special fabrics from San Francisco for Margaret's wedding dress. The citizens of San Bernardino, having witnessed Margaret's journey from deceived mail-order bride to respected businesswoman, embraced the upcoming nuptials with enthusiasm. Even the Thompsons, seemingly humbled by the events of Thanksgiving night, offered congratulations and a fine woolen blanket as an early wedding gift. Matthew, true to his word, made improvements to his ranch house. Margaret visited weekly to advise on the renovations, always properly chaperoned by Sarah or the Prestons' eldest daughter. What do you think? Matthew asked one crisp February afternoon as they stood in the newly expanded kitchen. Sunshine streamed through windows that now boasted blue-checked curtains sewn by Margaret herself. It's wonderful, she said, turning slowly to take in the polished wooden cabinets and the large stove that had been delivered at considerable expense from Los Angeles. But you didn't need to do all this for me. I wanted to, he replied, watching her face. This house has been just shelter for years. Now it's becoming a home. Outside, the mountains stood sentinel against the clear blue sky, their peaks still snow-covered. The valley was beginning to show the first hints of spring, with wildflowers dotting the meadows nearest the ranch house. I can hardly believe this will be my home in 2 months, Margaret said, stepping onto the porch that wrapped around the front of the house. Matthew joined her, keeping a respectable distance that did little to disguise the longing in his eyes. Any regrets about staying in California? Margaret thought of Boston, its familiar streets and customs, the life she had expected to lead there. None, she said honestly. My parents would have worried at first, I think, but they would have understood eventually. They always wanted my happiness above all. And are you happy, Margaret? She turned to him, her heart full. Happier than I ever imagined possible. As April arrived, bringing with it an explosion of wildflowers across the valley, final preparations for the wedding consumed Margaret's days. The ceremony would be held at the Presbyterian church in town, followed by a celebration at the Lawson ranch. The night before her wedding, Margaret sat with Sarah in the room above the store that had been her home since arriving in San Bernardino. I can't believe tomorrow I leave this room for good, Margaret said, running her hand over the simple quilt that had kept her warm through the California winter. You'll always have a place here if you need it, Sarah assured her, though I suspect my brother would have something to say about that, Margaret smiled. I'll miss working with you every day. You'll still be my partner in the store, Sarah reminded her, just with additional responsibilities. She squeezed Margaret's hand. Matthew is a good man, the best I know, but don't let ranching consume you entirely. Keep your hand in the business, it will give you independence and purpose beyond being a rancher's wife. I intend to, Margaret promised. Matthew and I have already discussed it. 3 days a week at the store, the rest at the ranch, Sarah nodded approvingly. You've both come a long way from where you started. Matthew was so solitary before you came, dedicated to his work but missing something essential. And you? I was lost, Margaret admitted. Desperate enough to marry a stranger based on a few letters and a daguerreotype. And now you're marrying a different stranger, Sarah teased. Margaret laughed. Not a stranger anymore. Now he's the man I love, the one I choose with my eyes wide open. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. Margaret stood before the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman reflected there. Her wedding dress, fashioned from ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, was far finer than anything she could have afforded in Boston. Her mother's locket hung at her throat, a connection to her past as she stepped into her future. Sarah helped arrange white rosebuds in her upswept hair. You look beautiful, she said, blinking back tears. Truly a California bride. The church was filled to capacity when Margaret walked down the aisle on Judge Preston's arm, the older man having kindly offered to stand in for her father. But Margaret scarcely noticed the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on Matthew, waiting for her at the altar, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration that made her heart soar. Dearly beloved, the minister began, his voice carrying through the hushed church. We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Margaret as she stood beside Matthew, their hands joined. The vows they exchanged were traditional but spoken with such conviction that many in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister finally declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Matthew's kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet promising more when they were alone. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening. Tables set up under the oak trees groaned with food contributed by half the county. Fiddlers played while children chased fireflies and couples danced on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion. As twilight deepened, Matthew led Margaret away from the festivities toward a secluded spot overlooking the valley. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and lanterns from the party glowed behind them like earthbound constellations. Happy? He asked, drawing her into his arms. Completely, she assured him, resting her head against his chest. Though I'm beginning to think we might never get a moment alone. Matthew chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. Sarah promised to begin suggesting to guests that they've overstayed their welcome within the hour. Your sister is a treasure, as are you, Mrs. Lawson. His voice grew serious. When you stepped off that stagecoach last summer, I had no idea how completely you would change my life. I thought I was content with my solitary existence, but now I can't imagine returning to it." Margaret raised her face to his. "You never will," she promised. "Whatever challenges come our way, we'll face them together." Their kiss was unhurried and deep, sealed with the certainty of a love that had grown not from desperate circumstances, but from mutual respect and genuine affection. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and they were finally, blissfully alone, Matthew led Margaret through their home, her trunks now unpacked, her belongings integrated with his in a tangible representation of their new shared life. In their bedroom, Margaret unpinned her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back. Matthew watched from the doorway, his expression a mixture of reverence and desire that made her blush despite her boldness. "Come here, husband," she said softly, extending her hand. He crossed the room in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms. "I love you, Margaret Lawson," he whispered against her hair, "now and always." "And I love you," she replied, all hesitation vanishing in the certainty of their commitment, "now and always." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Their first winter as a married couple tested them with heavy rains that flooded part of the lower pasture, requiring round-the-clock work to save the affected livestock. Margaret proved herself as capable on the ranch as she had been in the store, learning quickly and working alongside her husband when necessary. Their partnership extended to all aspects of life. 3 days each week, Margaret still worked at the general store, maintaining her financial independence while helping Sarah expand the business. The other days found her managing the ranch accounts, establishing a productive kitchen garden, and gradually transforming the house with thoughtful touches that reflected their shared tastes. In the spring of 1877, Margaret discovered she was expecting their first child. Matthew's joy was boundless and matched only by his protective instincts, which Margaret gently but firmly managed. "I'm pregnant, not incapacitated," she reminded him when he tried to prevent her from helping with the spring planting. "Women have been having babies while working the land since the beginning of time." Nevertheless, she did concede to reduce her hours at the store as her pregnancy progressed, using the additional time at home to prepare for the baby and expand her garden to include medicinal herbs recommended by Mrs. Preston, who had raised 5 children on her own ranch. Their son, James Matthew Lawson, arrived on a cold December night with Sarah and the local midwife in attendance. Matthew paced the front porch for hours, deaf to the assurances of Mr. Preston and several neighboring ranchers who had stopped by with whiskey and encouragement. When Sarah finally called him inside, Matthew approached the bedroom with uncharacteristic hesitation. The sight that greeted him, Margaret propped against pillows, tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms, stopped him in his tracks. "Come meet your son," Margaret said softly. Matthew sat carefully on the edge of the bed, accepting the swaddled infant with hands that trembled slightly. "He's perfect," he whispered as the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his much larger one. Margaret watched them together, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain her happiness. "He has your chin," she observed. "And your determination," Matthew replied with a smile as the infant squirmed energetically. "He didn't make his entrance into the world quietly, from what Sarah tells me. Life with a child brought new rhythms to the ranch." James thrived in the fresh air and sunshine, growing into a sturdy toddler with his father's thoughtful expression and his mother's curiosity. Margaret found unexpected fulfillment in motherhood while maintaining her involvement in both the store and ranch operations. In 1880, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Sarah, completing their family. The little girl inherited her father's blue eyes and her mother's chestnut hair, along with a strong will that kept them all on their toes. As the children grew, so did the Lawson ranch. Matthew's reputation for fine horses spread throughout California and beyond, bringing new business and prosperity. The original house was expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and frequent visitors, including Sarah, who doted on her niece and nephew. Thompson's prediction of failure for Matthew's expanded operation proved utterly wrong. By 1885, the Lawson Ranch employed 8 full-time hands and shipped horses as far east as St. Louis. Margaret's management of the financial aspects proved as crucial as Matthew's expertise with the animals, creating a true partnership that was the envy of many in the county. The general store prospered as well. Margaret and Sarah expanded into a larger building on San Bernardino's Main Street in 1883, adding a dedicated millinery department and a small lending library that became a community gathering place. 10 years after their wedding, Matthew and Margaret stood together on the same ridge where he had first shown her the valley. Their children played nearby under the watchful eye of James's godfather, a former ranch hand now promoted to foreman. "Did you ever imagine this?" Matthew asked, his arm around her waist as they surveyed their domain, the whitewashed ranch buildings, the corral where yearlings pranced in the spring sunshine, the orchards Margaret had insisted on planting that now produced abundant fruit. "Never," she admitted. "When I stepped off that stagecoach and learned the truth about Thompson, I thought my life was over before it had properly begun." And now, Margaret turned to face him, reaching up to trace the lines that a decade of sun and laughter had etched around his eyes. At 42, Matthew was still as handsome to her as the day they'd met, perhaps more so for the years they'd shared. "Now I know it was just beginning," she said. "Everything before was merely preparation for the life we've built together." His kiss was as tender as those they'd shared as newlyweds, yet deepened by years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges weathered side by side. "Mama, Papa, look what I found." 8-year-old James called, running toward them with something clutched carefully in his hands. 5-year-old Elizabeth followed more slowly, her doll tucked securely under one arm. Matthew kept his arm around Margaret as they turned to receive their children, their love for each other now expanded and multiplied in these small lives they'd created together. "What treasure have you discovered, son?" Matthew asked, kneeling to examine the perfectly preserved arrowhead James proudly displayed. As Margaret watched her husband and children, she reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this place and these people. Thompson's deception, which had seemed so devastating at the time, had ultimately led her to authentic happiness, not the constrained life she would have led as his second, secret wife, nor the conventional existence that would have awaited her in Boston, but a rich tapestry of experience woven from love, partnership, and the freedom to define herself on her own terms. The California sun warmed her face as she joined her family's examination of James's find, thinking how appropriate it was that her son had discovered an artifact of those who had loved this land before them. Like that arrowhead, preserved across time, the legacy she and Matthew were building would endure long after they were gone in their children, in the ranch that bore their name, and in the community they had helped to strengthen. It was, Margaret reflected as Matthew's arm slipped back around her waist, everything she had never known to hope for and all she would ever need.